Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on flood insurance and climate risks. I'm Ashley Lawson. I'm a senior fellow here at C2ES, and we're very excited that you were all able to join us today to talk about this topic that has been making a lot of news over the last several months. We've had over 200 people register for the webinar today, so we know that it's not just us at C2ES excited and interested in this topic, but that all of you are interested in learning more as well. Before we start, I just wanted to review a few housekeeping items with you. This webinar is being recorded, and we will post it to our website at c2es.org, so you should be able to still review the contents of the webinar and share with your colleagues after today. We'll take questions at the end, but you can always enter questions as we go along into the GoToWebinar interface that you have. I'll try to ask any clarifying questions that come up for our panelists along the way, but we will save most questions until the end. Here's our agenda for today. We have a great lineup of speakers with many years of experience working on NFIP, and I'll introduce each of them in more detail as we go along. They're going to walk us through the program from its founding to the current debate in Congress about reforms. We'll hear stories about what works, what doesn't work, especially in light of the increasing frequency of flood events that we've seen in recent years, and also talk about how the program might change moving forward. Before that, I'd like to briefly introduce C2ES for those of you who may be joining us for the first time. The Center for Climate and Energy Solutions is an independent and nonpartisan nonprofit organization focused on strong policy and action to address climate change. Our core mission is to forge practical solutions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to promote clean energy, and to strengthen resilience to climate impacts. We do this by bringing together city, state, and national policymakers, along with businesses and other stakeholders. We have a group of businesses that we work most closely with as part of our Business Environmental Leadership Council. We try to learn from these companies what types of policies work in their sectors, and we hope that they learn a little from us as well. This is the largest US-based group of companies that are devoted solely to addressing climate change, and I would encourage you to visit our website to learn about the BELC and what the member companies are doing. Lastly, I'd like to acknowledge the funders of today's webinar. This event is part of our Solutions Forum program of activities, an effort we have convened the last several years to work on solutions to climate and energy challenges. And we're very grateful to the Bank of America, to the Energy Foundation, and to the JPB Foundation for supporting this work. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Kristiane Huber, who's going to give us a brief look at the history of the NFIP. Kristiane is our Resilience Fellow here at C2ES and specializes in how communities are adapting to climate change impacts. Kristiane, over to you.
Thank you, Ashley. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kristiane. I'm from C2ES, and as Ashley said, I work as a Resilience Fellow here. I research climate impacts and how cities, businesses, or states can be more resilient to those changing conditions and the uncertainty related to climate change. So today we're discussing the National Flood Insurance Program, or the NFIP. The NFIP is a federal program administered by FEMA, and it has three primary objectives. The first is to mitigate future flood losses through building and zoning ordinances. The second is to provide access to affordable, federally backed flood insurance protection for property owners. And the third is to identify areas of flood risk in insurance rate maps, abbreviated as FIRMs. And those are used to set premium rates and identify areas that should be following those special building and zoning ordinances. We at C2ES have been following NFIP reform because our resilience program looks for opportunities in existing policy to encourage resilient practices and help communities be more prepared for climate impacts. The NFIP is clearly an opportunity to do that, and much like other resilience strategies, reforms in the program that might equip communities to be more resilient or reward communities that have taken action can also have co-benefits like saving the country money or saving lives. So from here, I'll be doing a quick overview of the flooding challenges that caused the federal government to develop the NFIP, and some of the continued challenges to the program and alterations in recent history that will frame the discussion about challenges and reforms today. Next slide, please. So since the mid-19th century, the federal government had mostly responded to flood events with flood control projects like levees and drainage channels, as you see in this picture on the left. Some private flood insurance was offered, but major losses from different events early in the 20th century, especially the event pictured here, the 1927 Mississippi River flood, are blamed for causing private insurers to stop offering flood policies. And also following these events, the primary response from the government was really just disaster aid. And following those events the government really continued to promote and fund flood control projects through a number of flood control acts enacted throughout the 20th century. And the government, despite continuing to invest in those projects, they proved to have little impact on reducing damages from flooding. Next slide, please. So the idea for a national flood insurance program was proposed and drafted in the 1950s, but the National Flood Insurance Act, which established the National Flood Insurance Program, was passed in 1968. The NFIP required, and still does, that communities adopt a floodplain ordinance that limits development in the floodplain, now called a Special Flood Hazard Area, or SFHA, which you can see marked in the firm that we have on the slide. Once the community agreed to this, citizens would be able to purchase flood insurance policies. Those were purchased through private insurers who process claims, but they take on none of the flood risk. Properties already constructed in flood-prone areas without knowledge of flood risk before there were firms received subsidized premiums, but anything constructed in the floodplain after those risks were mapped was expected to pay risk-based premiums into the program if they were participating. And then also in the National Flood Insurance Act of 1968, it said that in years that were especially expensive or with really numerous flooding events where the program experienced losses, the NFIP could borrow from the US Treasury up to a borrowing limit that is set by Congress each time they reauthorize the program. Next slide, please. So some changes or additional legislation that have addressed continued flood risk challenges since the National Flood Insurance Act passed included that despite subsidized rates, there was still low participation. And in flooding events after the NFIP was established, it was apparent that still a lot of communities that were at risk were not participating and actually really weren't helped by the program. So the National Flood Insurance Act was amended in 1973 to limit any lending or funding for acquisition or construction of properties in floodplains in communities that weren't participating in NFIP. And then in communities that were participating, flood insurance was a condition for any federally backed loans or any federal grants for any building that was located in a floodplain or an SFHA. The next challenge is increasing disaster costs. The NFIP's borrowing has become problematic with increasingly expensive disasters. In 2005, the NFIP paid out more in claims than it had in the entire life of the program up to that point, and that was following Hurricane Katrina and a couple other events. And that debt grew after Superstorm Sandy, which is the image on the slide. And by March of 2017, the debt was up to $24.6 billion. And that debt, of course, has increased as a result of Hurricanes Harvey and Irma and Maria, though some of that debt was forgiven this past fall. So Congress is needed to increase the program's borrowing authority almost every time it was reauthorized. And that now that borrowing limit is up to $30.4 billion, which was set after Superstorm Sandy. And that's considerably higher than the borrowing limit that was set in 1968, even accounting for inflation. The NFIP faces a tough challenge of balancing risk-based rates with affordability. In 2012, legislation called Bigger Waters was passed, which directed FEMA to phase in risk-based premiums instead of these subsidized premiums that many property holders had, or policyholders. And those changes in rates were mostly repealed in the 2014 Homeowner Flood Insurance Affordability Act because higher premiums were found to discourage program participation, and early in that implementation of those rate increases, that issue became really apparent. And then there haven't actually been any changes to NFIP to address this, but the last challenge I wanted to note is that the firms, the maps that identify flood-prone areas and set rates, only use historic data and have little consideration of uncertainty or future conditions. And that's in terms of changing weather patterns as well as changing flood conditions that might happen because of changes in land use within the watershed. So that is my quick overview of the history of NFIP and sort of the continued challenges that the program faces. And now we can hear more about how this looks in communities and what reform is still needed.
Absolutely. Thanks, Kristiane. So as you said, we're going to zoom in to the local level, away from the words on the page of the acts that have legislated this program, and to really start to understand how this has changed the way that communities are addressing flood risk on the ground. And in part to stress a point that we think is key, that flooding is not only a concern for coastal areas, we're going to start with a perspective from communities along the Mississippi River. To bring that perspective, we're very pleased to have Colin Wellenkamp with us today. Colin is the Executive Director of the Mississippi River Cities and Towns Initiative. Colin's extensive career in the legal and policy fields has been focused on advocating and advancing public interests through improving local government functions and the activity of the business world. He is dedicated to assisting organizations and people to transition to a sustainable way of life. So Colin, over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, and thank you to C2ES for this opportunity. Good afternoon, everybody. Very happy to be with you. Just to give you a quick picture of what the Mississippi River Cities and Towns Initiative is, MRCTI. It's an association of U.S. mayors along the Mississippi River in all 10 states. So from the first city, Bemidji, to the last, New Orleans. We are an association of 80 cities. There are 124 mayor-led municipalities on the Mississippi River. Next slide, please. And of the 124 mayor-led municipalities, those dots there on the slide are basically our 80 cities. We have 80 of them, so over half are part of the association. We're currently led by two co-chairs, the mayor of Davenport, Iowa, and the mayor of St. Gabriel, Louisiana, lead our association. They're assisted by an executive committee of 10 mayors, one from each of the Mississippi River states. And what I'm going to do is basically just outline for you the challenges, major challenges that we've been witnessing on the Mississippi River vis-a-vis the flooding, but also the insurance program itself, its changes, how it's changed on the ground, and then talk about some other solutions that the mayors have taken on themselves, and trying to develop those solutions at corridor scale. And that's sort of what's new here with us. In the past, pursuant to the National Flood Insurance Program, this situation has been very local. So protecting them from floods and natural disasters, and then responding to and recovering from, has all been a local capacity. But because of the change in climate risk over the last 15 to 20 years, that paradigm is shifting from local jurisdiction to really corridor-wide methods because the impacts are corridor-wide and the solutions really are corridor-wide as well. If you're a city on the Mississippi River, you can only do so much to make your city resilient and to respond to flooding without the help of the folks above you that are doing the same thing and might be doing implementing practices that are sending a lot more water to your town than could otherwise be, thereby increasing your risk significantly. So mayors have realized that if they approach these issues at corridor scale, then the solutions become much more effective and the cost is reduced. What we're looking at is just in terms of some broad strokes in defining the problem. Although floods are the country's most common natural disaster, according to FEMA, we would agree with that. A relatively small percentage of properties, only about 5 million nationally, have federal flood insurance. And a far smaller fraction of that has private flood coverage. So there's quite a gap there. And as was said earlier, the National Flood Insurance Program is now $25 billion, north of $25 billion in debt, or as of the fall, and then some of that was forgiven. And now we have, in 2012, we kind of fought hard for what was called the 3 strikes provision in the NFIP. Our association was just getting started back in 2012. We haven't actually been around very long. We've only been around going on 6 years now. The 3 strikes provision was a win for us in that properties, after being hit 3 times in a row, you no longer had any choice. You couldn't receive coverage anymore after the 3rd strike. So this was an incentive for folks to move out of the floodplain, which is basically what we've been working on since 2012. So, and then also since 2005, I just want to run down for you some of the impacts that the Mississippi River Valley has been sustaining since then. So between 2005 and 2017, the Valley has sustained over $200 billion in disaster impacts, with each of the 10 states incurring a minimum of $5 billion in damages. And then give you an example of some of those states. So there's 4 of those states that have sustained impacts between 10 and 20 billion: Iowa, Illinois, Missouri, and Tennessee. And then Mississippi has sustained impacts between 20 and 50 billion. This is all since 2005. And then, of course, Louisiana, given the hurricane impacts, they are north of 100 billion since 2005. We're at north of 50 billion for the corridor since 2011 alone, and north of 10 billion since 2016 alone. Baton Rouge in August of 2016 sustained a 1,000-year rain event as much water fell out of the sky in the suburbs of Baton Rouge in 3 days as flows through the Mississippi River in 18 days. So it was literally like someone channeled the Mississippi River into the suburbs of Baton Rouge for 18 days and then put the river back. That's how much water landed on that area. So that's pretty much no matter what you do, that kind of a rain event, you're going to get flooded. But there's some solutions out there that the mayors are interested in pursuing above and beyond FIP reform that can mitigate our costs. Next slide, please. And sort of the areas that I want to highlight for you are these green circle areas where some of these practices are really being implemented and concentrated on. I'll just go north to south. So you've got, to start off, the top circle there, that's Davenport. Davenport has actually designed their riverfront park to be their flood control facility. They don't have a flood wall. They don't have a levee. They don't have tons and tons of pumps. They've got a park. The park has got a lot of green space, and it's got facilities on it that are designed to flood, including their minor league baseball stadium. Voted, by the way, one of the top minor league baseball stadiums in the country. It is designed to turn into an island. The whole park floods. The pavilions flood. Water comes up to basically where the downtown area starts, and then the waters recede out. So it creates natural slack in their riverfront area there to absorb that water instead of sort of shifting the problem then downriver to another city like Muscatine or Keokuk or Canton, Missouri. Then if you move south a little bit to that second circle there that is the St. Louis area, we have two things going on there. Grafton, Illinois, which is just northeast of St. Louis on the Mississippi. That mayor there is restoring a wetland that used to be at the city. So just north of the city, there used to be a wetland there that would act as a natural buffer to floods and storm events. It also helped clean their water. It was a natural wetland that had grown there because right nearby is the confluence of the Illinois and the Mississippi rivers. And then just south of them is the largest confluence in the continent, and that's the Missouri and the Mississippi River confluence. So there's a lot of water there, all coming together. And the natural wetlands that had grown around these confluences acted as natural flood control. As they were torn out over the past century for development, that natural infrastructure was lost. And lo and behold, cities were then subject to a lot more danger and risk. We're trying to put that natural infrastructure back in place. Something a little bit closer to the skyscrapers, if you will, and near downtown St. Louis, another project, it's part of their North Riverfront Development Plan, is to actually include park space, again, that is designed to flood, pick up slack from the Mississippi River, and take pressure off of Jefferson County, Missouri, which is just south of St. Louis, as well as East St. Louis and the cities in Illinois there on the other side of the river. Then as you move down farther, it's not a circle, but just south of St. Louis, just south of that circle there, is another community that I just want to mention called Arnold, Missouri. And I really like Mayor Counts. I give him a lot of credit because he has been flooded out now every spring for the past 4 springs and incurring a lot of damage. He's got about 50 homes that get flooded. He's got to move them out and then repair the homes. It's an extreme expense. And his goal is to just move the folks out of the floodplain. He doesn't want to build a wall. He doesn't want to build a levee. He says, I want a riverfront park that acts as my flood control like they have in Davenport. That's what he wants to put in. And then create an amenity that attracts business and quality of life to his town with the park. Put in biking trails and walking trails, which is what Davenport has been able to do. The other 2 circles, real quickly, that large circle there encompasses a broad area that is part of the Cape Girardeau, Missouri, which incurred the largest flood record in recorded history on New Year's Day of 2016. And then you have Memphis there and Helena, Arkansas. Helena, Arkansas is that mayor wants to put in a retention lake in the neighborhoods that are next to the river that are most vulnerable. He's got a whole neighborhood is basically eroding into the Mississippi River in his town, and he wants to relieve that pressure by channeling that water into a lake. Again, creating an amenity for his town. The lake would then have walking paths and biking paths around it. Dubuque, Iowa did something very similar to reduce flooding in their city. They daylit a creek that was put underground. They brought it back above ground and naturalized it again. And now that creek, it empties into the Mississippi River. That was the properties that were near that creek before it was daylit were the least desirable properties in the whole region. They were the cheapest home prices. Now it is the most sought after properties in the region because of this new natural amenity that exists. And then finally, the last circle there in northern Mississippi, northern Louisiana, you have that is Tallulah and Vicksburg area and Natchez, all wanting to increase the natural infrastructure to reduce their flood problems. Not do this with brick and mortar and gray infrastructure, but pursue it with natural solutions. It's actually, we're working with the Nature Conservancy right now to have a wildlife habitat assessment built into the next Water Resource Development Act that would actually plan out for the Corps of Engineers the best areas of habitat to restore to give us the best disaster resilience in the southern reaches of the Mississippi River. Next slide, please. What I wanted to show you once the next slide comes up, sorry, a little delay, is just some of the, oh, you missed one, too many. There we go. Is a difference in 2011 between normal river flows. This is in the middle reaches of the Mississippi River to the southern, coming into the southern area, of what the 2011 flood looked like. This was a 500-year flood event. It was followed by a 100 and then a 200-year flood event just in a year and a half later, as well as a 50-year drought the next year. So it was, we've been on a roller coaster ride. But you see the amount of water here that we're talking about, and where the river was at its widest point during the 2011 flood, the river was up 15 miles across. So it was almost like looking at an inland sea. In 1993, where the Mississippi and the Missouri coalesced, the river was 20 miles across in the 1993 flood. Next slide, please. This just gives you a picture of some of the folks that we're talking about. The bottom gentleman there, that is the mayor of Cape Girardeau, Harry Rediger. He's pointing out at the flood, more flooding that he incurred just this last May. He didn't hit a new record, but he got close again to the all-time record. And above him are mayors, the mayor of Vicksburg, Vidalia, Greenville, and Tallulah, and others in the same flooding. I just wanted to show you a concrete example of these mayors coming together for the very first time, actually, up and down the Mississippi River to pursue these solutions. Next slide, please. And not all floods are equal. Like when we talk about flooding, we're not just talking about how much water. The season that the flood takes place in is also very important. The top picture is the flood, the New Year's flood of 2015, 2016. So end of 2015, beginning of 2016, we had a major flood event, a record flood event for the Alton-Grafton area. And I wanted to show you a picture of all the debris in the Mississippi River floating by the arch. If you see all that debris there approaching the highway and going under the bridge, this was the significant detail of this flood. We don't normally have floods like this in the wintertime. Most of the time they take place in July or August or even September, where there's plenty of growth and vegetation to hold debris back. But since this took place in late December, early January, all that debris was free to flow at will, and it did, and that actually increased significantly the amount of erosion, the amount of damage, and not just damage to property, but damage to infrastructure and damage to the landscape. We had whole areas of landscape scoured out by giant logs, giant piles of logs just floating in big bundles down the Mississippi River. So that actually created a whole other slew of impacts. Last picture there is, if you're wondering, why would anybody want to live next to the Mississippi River with all this risk? Well, that last picture at the bottom there tells you why. That's a picture of Grafton, Illinois, just to the right of taking that picture is where they want to put restore the wetland. But it is a gorgeous river valley with some of the best views in the continent, and it's also a tremendous resource. It's a $500 billion river, generating $500 billion in revenue just for the valley itself, directly supporting 1.5 million jobs, 7 economic sectors, and it's responsible for our nation's only trade surplus. So if we're going to protect all of these assets, all of this economy, and all of these industries, then we really need to not only take care of the built infrastructure, but the natural infrastructure, which offers a lot of cheaper, sustainable solutions to flooding. If we can manage to do it at the appropriate scale, and that's what we've been working on. I do have some good news to share in that we've been able to increase, working with the Mississippi River Caucus in the House and Senate, we've been able to increase the amount of money for pre-disaster mitigation work. This is the federal account that helps states and localities before the disaster comes, taking that from $22 million a year now to $100 million a year. It's been at $100 million now for the last 2 cycles. I'd love it to be in the billions, but at least it's had a 4-fold increase, which is a pretty good achievement. We've definitely been able to put that money to work. So those are some concrete examples on how we're trying to augment some of the deficiencies with the NFIP program itself, and the fact that it is extremely oversubscribed. We don't see that dynamic changing. In fact, we see it worsening, especially since we're dealing with not just flooding anymore, but drought is a significant issue. The 2012 drought was a $35 billion hit for us, second most expensive natural disaster on Earth for the year 2012. Sandy was the most expensive. And drought has its own costs and its own problems. So considering that we just need to pursue resilience, period. These are, again, some of the nature-based solutions that we've been having luck with and have been able to generate some results around at corridor scale. Thank you. Happy to answer any questions folks may have.
Thanks so much for sharing that perspective, Colin. And I'm especially glad that you brought up the point about seasonality. This is really one of those thornier climate change impacts that I think folks are still wrestling with understanding. As snow melt is occurring earlier in the year, and as there's a shift in precipitation patterns, you see the change in the time of year when flood events might occur. and how much more challenging that is to deal with. We have had some questions come in, and I do thank people for entering those questions. But in the interest of time, I think we're going to move on to our other two speakers to make sure that they are able to share their perspectives, and then hopefully we'll have time for questions at the end. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce our next speaker, who has been working on implementing the community rating system, which is a major part of the NFIP that seeks to reduce flood risks, which is of course good for homeowners, good for the program's financial viability overall, and good for many other reasons. So we have with us today Dr. Monica Farris, who is Director of the Center for Hazards Assessment, Response, and Technology at the University of New Orleans, or UNO-CHART. She's an Associate Professor of Research there, where she has 15 years experience in multidisciplinary research focused on a variety of topics related to building and enhancing hazard-resilient communities. Monica, over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity to talk about the community rating system and the work that several Louisiana communities are doing to address risk in Louisiana. Next slide, please. Before I jump into the CRS, I want to provide a little background on UNO-CHART, who we are and what we do. UNO-CHART is an applied social science hazards research center that partners with and supports Louisiana communities in efforts to achieve disaster resilience. Since 2001, CHART continues to work with various stakeholders to assist residents and local and state officials in reducing risk to hazards and to help them gain a better understanding of their risks and what they can do to protect themselves from the impact of the hazards. We work in multidisciplinary teams of faculty, staff, and students from various departments on our campus: political science, planning, urban studies, engineering, to name a few. And the goals of each of our projects really determine who participates in our projects. Next slide, please. To give an idea of the types of projects we work on, I've listed a few here of our current and recently completed projects. Of course, what I plan to focus on today is our work with two CRS users groups. Next slide, please. The facilitation of two CRS users groups here in Louisiana has given us the opportunity to form relationships with local floodplain management officials from over 20 different communities around New Orleans and Baton Rouge. Every month, we facilitate CRS user group meetings where we work with communities on ways to implement floodplain management activities, which we hope will help reduce risk for flooding and reduce flood insurance premiums for the residents of these communities. Next slide, please. A little background on the community rating system, or the CRS. The CRS is a voluntary program for communities that already participate in the National Flood Insurance Program and who choose to implement and enforce strict floodplain management activities more than what is required under the NFIP. In exchange for implementing these higher regulations and flood reduction projects, residents within these communities may receive a reduction in their flood insurance premiums. The CRS is a very prescriptive program that is dictated by a coordinator's manual that is over 600 pages long. Next slide, please. Activities that receive credit within the CRS address the three goals of the program: to reduce and avoid flood damage to insurable property, to strengthen and support the insurance aspects of the NFIP, and to foster comprehensive floodplain management. Next slide, please. To earn credit, communities must complete prescribed activities that fall under these categories: public information, mapping and regulatory, flood damage reduction, and warning and response. Public information activities include such activities as advising people about flood hazards, encouraging the purchase of flood insurance, etc. Mapping and regulatory activities include programs that provide increased protection to new development, to include mapping areas not shown on the flood insurance rate maps, preserving open space, protecting natural floodplain functions, managing a community's stormwater, etc. Flood damage reduction activities include such activities as the development of a comprehensive floodplain management plan, the relocation or retrofit of flood-prone structures, maintaining drainage systems, and so on. And finally, warning and response activities include measures that protect life and property during a flood, maintenance of levees and dams, and a few others. Next slide, please. As communities implement these projects, they can earn points. The amount of points earned determines a community's CRS class, and the class determines the discount an NFIP policyholder may receive in that community. As you can see from the scale, the discounts range from 5% for a Class 9 to 45% for properties within the Special Flood Hazard Area, or the SFHA, in a Class 1 community. Preferred rate policies, or PRP, which you see to the far right, do not receive a discount as their policies are already discounted through the NFIP. Next slide, please. Across the United States, there are over 21,000 communities that participate in the NFIP, and about 5% of those communities participate in the CRS. Here in Louisiana, we have over 300 NFIP communities, with 14%, or 42 communities, participating. And most of the NFIP policyholders within Louisiana are located in these 42 communities. Our CRS communities range in class from 6 to 9, and the activities implemented by these communities have earned over $35 million in premium savings. Next slide, please. As this is a very prescriptive program and resource-intense, time and money, CRS user groups have formed across the United States to try to tackle some of these projects, and there are 4 such groups in Louisiana. And as I mentioned, CHART facilitates monthly meetings of 2 of these groups. Here, our users groups are informal organizations of people who are interested in participating in the CRS. They are administered locally, they set their own agendas, and we share information among the 4 groups that do exist. The 2 groups that CHART supports meet monthly to share ideas on how to implement CRS activities. We ask each other questions about floodplain management issues, we view webinars together, we have guest speakers, and we've also worked on some joint projects, a few of which I'll share in a moment. Please keep in mind that CRS coordinators are often local officials who hold full-time jobs as floodplain managers, building officials, permit officials, county clerks, etc. And the CRS is often something that is just added to their list of responsibilities. So CRS user group meetings provide a time each month for these officials to concentrate on the CRS and to learn from one another about the program. Next slide, please. Just to quickly give you an idea of the communities that are involved in these 2 groups, here's the CRAFT group, which is centered around the Baton Rouge area, along with their class numbers. So you can see they range from 7 to 9. Next slide, please. And here's the float group, which include communities around the Lake Pontchartrain Basin area. Notice that there is one parish that is not currently in the CRS, as all communities are invited to participate regardless of their status within the program. Next, please. With feedback from the groups, CHART sets monthly agendas for CRAFT and float meetings. Here's an example of an agenda from this year for CRAFT. You may be able to see, I know it's pretty small, there's a guest speaker from the Louisiana Department of Insurance for this particular meeting, a flyer that we have been working to develop for the group, upcoming trainings related to the CRS and the NFIP, updates on NFIP legislation, etc. So just to give you an idea of what's discussed, presented at these monthly meetings. And we usually have pretty full agendas. Our meetings are also attended often by our state CRS coordinator, our state hazard mitigation officer, and sometimes by our region's ISO representative, which is very helpful as he's the person who scores our communities within the program. And of course, all of the members contribute to our meeting agendas. Next, please. One of the projects both Float and CRAFT have recently completed are multi-jurisdictional PPIs, or Programs for Public Information. PPIs document formal strategies that determine how communities will distribute information on flood safety, flood insurance, and the protection of natural floodplains. Float and CRAFT Both agreed to develop multi-jurisdictional PPIs so that they could work on the PPI process together, as the process includes working with stakeholder committees made up of people outside their local governments, holding stakeholder committee meetings to discuss their flood hazards, to determine which audiences they should target with their messages, to formulate outreach messages, and to develop projects in which these messages can be delivered to target audiences. Communities get bonus points within the CRS for implementing projects that are included in their PPIs. As you can imagine, with so many communities working on one project, there were hurdles to overcome in the process, but working together allowed for us to have one set of meetings with stakeholders, to develop one set of meeting materials, and to have one final document per group to represent the entire group's efforts. And of course, each community has the responsibility to implement and document all of their outreach projects, as each community has to earn individual points within the CRS. Next, please. As part of the PPI process, Float and Craft also undertook another activity, which is under 370 within the program, known as flood insurance promotion. And this included an analysis of the flood insurance policies within each community and the development of a plan to conduct outreach focused on the importance of flood insurance. And as you can see here, this is just a summary of the number of policies or NFIP policies in force in the communities within Craft. Next slide, please. Following the analysis and planning, projects were developed that focused on flood insurance. This is an older draft of a flyer developed by the group, and as a group, we also developed a script for the communities to create short infomercials, if you will, with community leaders delivering the message of flood risk and the importance of flood insurance, as this activity needs to focus on flood insurance. Craft and Float are also working to develop flood response preparation documents, which will lay out the process each community takes related to education and outreach if a flood actually occurs within the communities. And this will include projects that are implemented before, during, and after a flood. Again, education and outreach activities. Next, please. And so for more information, here's how you can contact us or to get more information about our groups. And I should also mention as I close that we're currently working with the state and our Louisiana communities to develop a CRS strategy for the entire state that will be part of the hazard mitigation update that the state's working on for next year. So hopefully more to come in 2018. And thank you again for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you so much. I think it's so helpful to understand how these projects are implemented and the tremendous amount of effort that communities are putting into helping to reduce risk and to lower premiums for homeowners. So thank you for sharing your insights there. Thanks again also to people who are sending in questions. And again, I'm going to ask that we save those just a few more minutes to the end so that we can hear from our final speaker and turn our attention to the future of the NFIP. So as I believe many people on the line know, Congress is debating new reforms that can help strengthen the program and address some of the challenges that we've been discussing. A key voice in that debate is the Smarter Safer Coalition, and I should say in full disclosure that C2ES is a member of Smarter Safer. We have here with us Jenn Fogel-Bublick, who is managing that coalition. She is also a partner with Capital Counsel LLC here in Washington. She has over 18 years of experience working on housing, insurance, banking, and general financial issues with experience in the administration, Capitol Hill, nonprofits, and in the private sector. So she's going to speak with us about some of the debate in Congress and some potential areas of reforms that a lot of members are discussing. So Jenn, over to you.
Great, thanks. Ashley, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Thanks for that. As Ashley said, I manage the Smarter Safer Coalition. We are a broad-based coalition of conservation groups, insurance interests, taxpayer advocates, housing and mitigation groups. I will say I've been working on national flood insurance program policy and reform for over 14 years. So right now is an exciting time as we look to possible reauthorization and reform. If you go to the next slide, you can see the members of the Smarter Safer Coalition. As I said, really broad-based. We're sometimes described as sort of a strange bedfellows type of coalition. If you go to the next slide, this basically just lays out Smarter Safer's goals. The coalition essentially advocates for environmentally friendly, fiscally sound approaches to natural disaster policy. Our goals really are threefold. We want to better protect people in harm's way, better protect the environment, and better protect taxpayers. Next slide. Smarter Safer, unfortunately, believes that the National Flood Insurance Program does not effectively meet these goals. It's a critically important program and one that the coalition is incredibly supportive of continuing, but we also believe that the program has some inherent problems that need to be fixed. Subsidized rates since the inception of the program have masked risk both to communities and property owners. This means that people do not understand their true risk of flooding. There are not built-in incentives to mitigate for risk, and development in environmentally sensitive areas has been encouraged. Since we've already discussed background on NFIP, I'll try to go through the next couple of slides pretty quickly and then talk about the reforms that we're pushing for. So if you want to go to the next slide. This slide basically just shows the fiscal health of the National Flood Insurance Program and shows that the program has owed money to U.S. taxpayers, to Treasury, since 2005, essentially, since you had Hurricanes Katrina, Rita, and Wilma. And as folks earlier on the call discussed, as we see sort of increasing severity and intensity and frequency of storms, we expect this chart to look similar in the future. Next slide. So I know we've discussed a little bit about the borrowing authority and the status of the National Flood Insurance Program. The borrowing authority, when I first started working on NFIP, was $1.5 billion. It is now at $30 billion, but the program actually has had to borrow $45 billion from U.S. taxpayers. So that has created obviously a problem for the sustainability of the program, as it has become apparent that the program does not take in enough to pay claims, to repay the debt, or to put it on a more sustainable path. At the moment, we're in the midst of a number of short-term extensions of the National Flood Insurance Program. The program has been extended twice now since its authorization expired in September. It is set to expire on December 22nd, and we expect it to be extended yet again along with the government funding bill, the CR. The last time this program went through short-term extensions, there were 17 extensions and 4 lapses. So we could be in for a long ride before we get reauthorization of the program. Next slide. Given the status of the program, Smarter Safer has released a very detailed reform proposal that goes through all of the reforms that we would like to see to the National Flood Insurance Program. But I'm just going to go through our top 4 priorities, because I think those are the ones that will make the most difference in terms of putting this program on a more sustainable path, helping protect environmentally sensitive areas, and help protect people in harm's way. So if you go to the next slide. So our first priority is more accurate mapping. Mapping is the underpinning of the National Flood Insurance Program, and communities and property owners need to have confidence in the maps. And we know that right now, many people do not have confidence in those maps. Smarter Safer is advocating for more granular property-level data on flood maps. This means maps that show elevation. We know this can be done, and in some areas, states and communities have actually invested in LIDAR data to get property-level elevation. Unfortunately, FEMA maps don't contain this property-level information, which means, again, people don't really understand the true risk of flooding to their properties. We believe that it is necessary to have that data available to communities and to property owners so that people can understand their risks, can provide incentives to mitigation, and can tie rates to risk. Next slide. Our next priority is additional investments in mitigation. We know mitigation is cost effective. We know it saves lives. We know it saves property. Smarter Safer is advocating for additional funding for mitigation, as well as requirements that FEMA work with lenders to provide mitigation loans. We're also looking at whether or not we can require FEMA to look at shifting subsidies or premium support so that they can be used for upfront mitigation instead of just continuing to reduce rates. We believe that the best way to reduce rates is by reducing risk. Next slide. Smarter Safer also advocates to move to risk-based rates over time, coupled with affordability provisions for low-income homeowners. We understand that some people cannot and will not be able to afford their risk-based rates, and premium or mitigation support should be available to them. However, the program now provides subsidies regardless of income, and given the debt of the program, that is simply not sustainable. In addition, studies have shown that cross-subsidies exist in the program where higher income areas are actually paying less for their risks than lower income areas. We would like to see that change. Next slide. The last priority I'll discuss is consumer choice and private sector competition. We advocate for consumers to have choices in flood coverage. This means clarifying current law, which allows people to purchase private coverage to meet mandatory purchase requirements. There's nothing in law that says if you are required to purchase flood insurance, you must purchase it from NFIP. However, there are some regulatory hurdles, and lenders don't know what private insurance they can accept. For this reason, we are supportive of a bipartisan bill that actually passed the House last year, 419 to 0, and that would provide this clarification. And a recent study actually found that even in high-risk areas, a majority of properties could see lower rates in the private sector. We believe consumers should be able to choose whether they want to purchase NFIP or private insurance. And we also believe that consumers won't choose a private policy over NFIP unless it is more affordable, provides better coverage, or both. So where are we in reform? Very quickly, the House passed a reform bill in November. It extended the program for 5 years. It contains the first affordability provisions targeted at low-income people, provides additional mitigation investments, allows for private flood insurance, and makes some improvements in mapping. There are a number of Senate bills, but nothing is close to the finish line in the Senate. And right now there is no consensus in the Senate about how to move forward on flood insurance reform. Flood insurance reforms are contentious. They do not cut across party lines, but they really cut across geography. Our hope is that comprehensive reform can be passed in 2018 that meets the priorities that I've set forth today, all 4 of them, because they are incredibly important to making sure that the flood insurance program is healthy and actually meets the goals that Congress set for NFIP. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jenn, for coming and sharing that insight with us, and even being able to speak the words bipartisanship agreement in the House. I think that's not a phrase that we get to utter very often, and so hearing that this is one area of bipartisan agreement is very refreshing. We are very close to the top of the hour, but I did want to just pose a question, especially to Colin and to Monica, working with communities on the ground. We've had several people ask what I think is a very insightful question, and that is, how does the private sector feel about what communities and city leaders and floodplain managers are doing? You know, Colin, maybe you want to take this first. I know that there's a perception of some pushback from businesses when, for example, riverfront property is taken away from development and is preserved as a park and a way to absorb floodwaters when they happen. Can either of you share some insights in the communities you're working with about what the private sector thinks about this?
Sure. That perception is amending as we go through these impacts. I would say that was true a few years back, but because of the disasters we've been experiencing, that has softened quite a bit. And the private sector on the financing side has completely changed. We had 2 banks, Fifth Third Bank, Stifel Investments, and JP Morgan Chase's Sustainability Bank come and present to us this past September, and then before that in March in Washington, D.C. They held 2 sessions with us, one in D.C. and one in St. Louis, to let us know that actually the projects that they want to fund along in near water communities, they want to see that there is disaster mitigation capacity built into the projects. So JP Morgan Chase, the executive director of the Sustainability Bank, came to tell us, he said, look, I'm not really interested in funding the project that removes a marsh or a wetland to build a convention center on your waterfront. I'm interested in funding the project that is reinstalling a marsh or wetland next to your convention center to help protect it from flooding and storm events, and also to help clean your water. Those are they told us they want to see the climate capacities, climate risk mitigation capacities built into our projects. They feel that natural solutions are cheaper. They are easier to sustain. They have a larger payback over a longer period of time. And they do reduce risk many times more efficiently at a lower cost than gray infrastructure ever could. On top of that, so that's on the finance private sector side. Other areas of the private sector, we do have a corporate advisory board within our association. 2 of those members do include Tetra Tech, which is an international infrastructure conglomerate. I think they're number 3 in the world, and American Water, which of course maintains and builds water systems for cities in counties and states. So, and they are also sold on this methodology, reducing risks in that comes with smart development of your waterfront area. I'll use Louisville as an example. Louisville's waterfront park generated $500 million in development in the early part of its existence when they put in that park. Businesses wanted to move in next door to it. People wanted to be by the park, so the condominiums sprung up, apartment buildings sprung up. The Bourbon Tour is now headquartered right next to the park. So you had all of these businesses want to come and be by that natural amenity because that's where the people are. The people want to be in those places too. So it's a matter of approaching the land use in such a way that you get maximum resilience benefits without sacrificing too much of your economy. Indeed, maybe augmenting, increasing your economy with the amenities that come with that natural infrastructure.
Yeah, thanks for that. Monica, do you have any thoughts on that? Do you have businesses participating in the CRS user groups?
So not in the group meetings per se, but I will say throughout the Program for Public Information or the PPI process that I mentioned, we've had particular industries serve as on the stakeholder committee, bankers, realtors, and insurance companies. So we do have certain industries that have shown interest in supporting our CRS user groups and their floodplain management activities to reduce risk.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that. I'm afraid we are going to need to close now as we are a bit over our time. I do want to encourage everyone to visit c2es.org. We will have a link to a recording and the slides available there, so you'll be able to find them and review them later. And finally, just one more large thank you to our speakers today for sharing a lot of insights and giving us all something to think about. With that, have a nice rest of your day, everyone. Bye-bye.